Today I'm doing lines with Brennan again, and this time we're trying out a zesty new twist. He's choosing which card of his I'll be inspired by, and I chose one of mine for him to work on. First, a quick reminder. Line stands for list, include, modify, exclude, and spin, and it's just a fun way to remember how to look at an inspiration and make a card that is completely your own. Let's take a look at the card Brennan chose for me to use as inspiration. To be 100% honest, this probably isn't the card I would have chosen for myself. It's got pretty colors with my favorite orange, pink, and purple combination and black and white elements, but that light craft in the background is kind of beige and definitely not one of my go-tos. Brennan's done some stamping and die cutting as well as some embossing, I think, on that background. His sentiment is probably heat embossed. He's got flowers and a delicate damask background, which I love, but oval is not my thing. And honestly, neither is white heat embossing on black. So this one might be a bit of a challenge. Let me show you how I approached it. I made 4 cards altogether, and they range from practically copying to, are you sure these cards are related? For my first card, I went pretty true to the original with just a couple of changes. I started with what I like to call lazy ink blending. I've done this a few times before, and it's such a great alternative to full-on blending, especially when you're going to be adding some texture later on. I put down Tiki torch, then party dress, then flirty fuchsia inks onto a panel of white cardstock, making sure there was overlap so that the colors would mix a little. The pink and purple look okay, but the difference between the Tiki torch and the party dress is quite stark and not totally blending. No problem. To fix this, I grabbed an in-between shade, in this case, orange twist, and I just put down a narrow strip right over the area where the Tiki torch and party dress are, and that just makes the transition a little smoother. It's still not perfectly blended, but my next step is going to distract you from that. I've got my old Tim Holtz stamp positioner here. I keep it around for my red rubber background stamps. I can use them in my MISTI, but removing the sticky grip mat from the base just sometimes becomes a big process, so it's easier to just use this since I already have it. I'm going to create my background with this Batik stamp from Technique Junkies, and instead of stamping it with ink, I spritzed it with some water and stamped it down. For this technique to be successful, you need water-reactive inks and a fine mist of water onto the stamp so that you don't get big blobs of water or lose the pattern. And you need a little bit of patience. Right now you can barely see the pattern on the panel, but as the water dries, it kind of bleaches out the color. And if you're impatient like me, you can stamp it down again with water, but really the best thing is to just let it dry. And while I was doing that, I stamped my flowers. This is a sprig from an old Altenew set that I've always liked, and I used my MISTI and my solid black ink to get a nice crisp impression. This ink is Copic friendly, and my plan is to use 3 mid-gray Copics to get that darker look of the flowers on Brennan's card. I started with my darkest shade, the C7, and I put flicks of color into each flower and leaf where I thought the shadows would be. Then I went back with the C5 and I extended the shadows out a little bit. I'm trying to give the flowers the look of dimension, and also to just try and capture that depth that Brennan's flowers have. Finally, I went over both of these layers with the C3, and I also extended past the shadows again, leaving some pure white areas for contrast and interest. I used the coordinating die to cut it out. Okay, so let's quickly compare. I've got all the colors, and I even put a mat of craft behind my circle panel. I've done some stamping and some die cutting. I've got flowers, a damask background, and a white on black sentiment strip. I modified the way I created my background from embossing to water stamping. My sentiment is a stamp that stamps a black bar around the letters. I'm not sure I'm describing that correctly, but it's way easier than heat embossing. I left out the oval, of course, and the embossing on the background, and for my spin, my card is a 4¼ inch square, and I created a white frame around that craft mat. Still, this card is pretty much identical to the inspiration. Let's call it 90%. For my next card, I used my Copics again, but this time to create my background. I chose 5 colors in the orange, pink, purple range, and I simply drew lines across my 4-inch square panel. You can use a ruler, of course, but I find it pretty easy to stay mostly straight by doing vertical lines rather than horizontal, and by pulling my whole arm down each time. I repeated my pattern over and over again, so already we can see that there's going to be at least one big difference from Brennan's card. Next, I did some more coloring of stamped flowers. I started with this absolutely huge sunflower stamp from Simon Says Stamp. Obviously, that's not all going to fit, so I figured out how much of it to stamp in the bottom corner of a white panel by comparing it with my striped panel. Then I did some more coloring. I'll keep this quick because it's pretty much the same. The only difference is that I used the lighter gray markers this time to get a more airy feel, but I still used the darkest and mid-tone to create shadows and dimension, and then the lightest to blend it out to white. Again, I used the coordinating die to cut it out, and I popped it up over the background. I've included all the colors, even a sneaky little peek of the craft because I used it as my sentiment strip. I kept the flowers a little lighter this time, and my background interest comes from the repeating stripes rather than from an embossed pattern. And my sentiment is black on craft. I have no oval and no embossing. So I'm branching out. Let's call this one about 75%. The layout is still very similar, and it still has a similar look and feel. Okay, here we go. This time, I'm reversing the colors, and I'm putting the black and white on the background. This is a stencil from a Colorful Life Designs called Turntable, and this kind of groovy, curvy pattern reminded me a bit of Brennan's oval. I've put pixie spray on the back of this because the lines are pretty thin, but I don't have a ton of good experience working with pixie spray, so I just kept my right hand pretty close to my blending brush just to make sure that everything was staying in place. This time I'm using a black blending ink called Anthracite. I'm using a light hand in small areas, again to just try and make sure that the stencil lines aren't shifting. And it means I'm having to go over areas a little bit, but that's okay. And I was thinking to myself, okay, this is working. Don't get arrogant. Take your time. Be patient. But it really was working. The stencil really seemed to be stuck down. And then, of course, I found the area where the pixie spray obviously hadn't gripped, or I hadn't put enough on it, or whatever. And that just defined how I trimmed the panel down to a square. So now if my background is black and white, my flowers are where I'm going to bring in the colors. And that groovy looking background made me want to find some groovy looking flowers. These fab flowers from Simon Says Stamp are perfect. I put down an area of my 3 main colors and then an area of darker shade for each one as well to use for the outline die cut. I used Flirty Fuchsia as my darker shade for the party dressing. To emphasize the oval that I really don't want to include on my card, I trimmed around the 2 corners of the stenciled panel, and then I played around with the positioning of my 3 flowers. Then I had to glue those little outline pieces to the solid flower bases. I've seen people use puddles of glue and dip their die cuts in, or use sponges to get glue on the back of small items like this. So I gave both of those a try, but in the end I felt much more comfortable with just the narrow tip of my Barely Art glue. Let me know if you have a great way of gluing down skinny little pieces like this without glue smushing out everywhere. Now right off, we can see that we're probably down in the 40 to 50% range on this one. I've got the colors, including just a peek of craft. I've done die cutting instead of stamping, and my sentiment is white on black, which is the reverse of Brennan's. Speaking of reverse, I've got orange, pink, and purple flowers on a black and white background, and the whole feel is more Beetlejuice than classic, I would say. I've excluded any embossing. Now this is the final one, and I started with another red rubber background stamp. This one's a peel-apart pinstripe pattern from Simon Hurley. Next, I used the quilted cover plate from A Pocket Full of Happiness and a white panel to get all these little petals. I lined them up on my grip mat on my turntable so I can quickly add some color to them. I went in my rainbow order, trying to make sure I got 2 colors on each row of petals. I cut the cover plate again, this time from black cardstock, and I trimmed it down with my scissors so that it'll fit onto a square card. Then I had another painful little session of adding tiny dots of glue to the back, and I glued it onto the striped background panel, and I started inlaying the colorful petals. At this point, my plan was that these petals would be forming the flowers on my black and white background, similar to card 3, and I would make sure that they looked like flowers by putting cardstock dots in the flower centers. But when I got to the end, I felt like it really just looked like a background and it needed something more. So I grabbed a coordinating die from the Simon Says Stamp Flower Power set, and I cut it out for white cardstock. I also cut a black circle and I glued it to the center, and then I ran them both through my machine with the Altenew Dotty Circles 3D embossing folder. Then I made a fun surprise discovery. There is a larger 5-petal flower die in the same set, and when you stack them, the larger one forms a really good frame for the smaller one, which was exactly what I was looking for. Okay, let's take a look. I've got the colors except the craft. I've got one flower instead of three. I've got a colorful pattern from my background, but I've also introduced black and white into that, and that's not on the inspiration. I do have some embossing this time, but I excluded a sentiment altogether. And once again, the whole feel is just very different from Brennan's. But I do think this is a good example of just how far you can go from your starting point. And at the end of the day, if you're happy with your card, that's all that matters. So what have we learned today? As always, you can be inspired in many ways, and you can pretty much always find something in your stash to get a similar look. But second, and maybe more importantly, you get to decide how similar or different you want your result to be. There's a whole range, and by focusing on the things you like best in your inspiration piece, you're free to go as near or as far from it as you want. Now it's time to head to Brennan's channel to see how he was inspired by this card of mine. It's one of my recent favorites, but maybe it's not one of Brennan's. I'll see you over there. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.